I am retired Master Sergeant Ruben Ortiz from the 1st Cavalry Division. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce this morning Tom Crosby, who proudly represents the 1st Cavalry Division by his pin that he wears here. And I will turn the mic over him and let him speak for a few moments.
Thank you, Rudy. I appreciate that. Whoa. Okay. I'm very, very honored to be wearing this 1st Cav pin because the 1st Cavalry Division, saved my life and our family's life 65 years ago after 3 years in a Japanese prison camp in Manila, Philippine Islands. And they spearheaded through the Japanese lines to rescue us. We were living in the Philippines before the war broke out. Our whole family was over there. I was born there. My brother was born there. And so we had a good life until Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Philippines on the same day were also bombed, all the military installations and airfields. We were taken to the University of Santa Tomas in Manila by the Japanese. We were told to pack up 3 days worth of food, clothing, bedding, and mosquito net, and which we did. And the University of Santa Tomas, we found out, was a Catholic university that was built in 1611 with no dormitory facilities. So they put us all in there and separated all the women, separated all the elder men that were on the gymnasium floor, about 700 of them. And that's the way they lived for the next 3 years. They took my brother and I was 8 years old, he was 7, and they put us in with the young men in another building that where the commandant and the rest of the Japanese guards were, and that's where we stayed. During the day, we could be a family, but between roll calls, we had roll call in the evening, roll call in the evening and morning, and we had to go to our different buildings at night. Not once in those 3 years, 37 months, were we with our mom at night. The hardest part was the lack of food. We had an interning committee that organized the camp with the Japanese telling us what we could do and what we couldn't do, and that was it. And so, as anybody knows, the Philippines is very hot and very, very humid, and there are monsoons that when it rains for weeks, and when we try to grow a vegetable garden, it's only good for a little over a year, and then you start over. We had lugao was our main meal. It was rice, water, and whatever else you could put in with it. And everybody had chores, keep the camp clean. When we first started out, there were about 3,000 of us in camp. It grew to almost 4,400. They had to create another camp in Los Baños, where they transferred a little over 1,000 POWs. The ending is where I really have to. Well, for a long time, I had what they call today PTSD. We didn't know what it was then, but it's a remembrance of bad experiences, bad times, and for a long time, I didn't want to go back to that, and I had difficulties, and I'll share that with you. when the first Cav found out that the Palawan massacre had occurred in the latter part of 1944, and if you see the movie The Great Raid, you'll see in the very beginning where the Japanese in the island of Palawan, or Palawan, down in the north end of the Philippines. If you go on Google, you'll find a beautiful resort there, but the people who go to that resort don't have any idea that there was that massacre that changed and saved by those 147 men perishing because of the Japanese burning them alive. MacArthur heard about that. He also heard that the orders from Tokyo were to kill all civilian and military prisoners so there wouldn't be any witnesses to any of their atrocities. As it turned out, the first Cav, our hero, thank you, Rudy, for always being there, they spearheaded through the Japanese army and got to us on February 3rd, 1945. My brother and I were in that building with the Japanese. The rest of the camp was rescued by the first Cav, about 200 of them. It started out to be about 800 in 3 serials that headed down from Lingayen Gulf to get to us, but they also had other missions. They had to rescue Bilibid prison and a couple others, the Presidential Palace, things like that. There were still, the Japanese army was all entrenched in the city of Manila. And when they got to us, the Filipino scouts and guerrillas, along with the first Cav, came in the camp, took the camp. Japanese outside didn't know that they were in there. And then what the Japanese did in our building, moved us all up to the 3rd floor, and then we became hostages. There were 220 of us, my brother and I, and 200 plus, and my mom, my grandmother, and my aunt. They were free, and they started to watch all this. This was about 10 o'clock at night. And first Cav, the Japanese were shooting at them. There were 65 of them, including the commandant, Hayashi. And it's pitch black, and I still remember being near one of the windows and watching the tracers coming up from the first Cav, taking out the ceiling over our head. I'm 11 now. My brother's 10. And and it was really scary. Now, the first Cav didn't know that the internees were in there. They just knew that the Japanese were shooting at them, so they shot back, put the tanks in front. The only shots from the tank were just some shots for effect down in the 1st story, but we were all up in the 3rd, so we were getting 30s and 50s shot at us. Finally, somebody up, one of the internees yelled that we were in there. So we heard it on the bullhorn down below that for us to move to the back of the room, lay down, and which we did, and then all hell broke loose again. More shooting, more shrapnel everywhere. And it probably only lasted for a few minutes, but it was scary enough for me to remember the Lord's Prayer. It was really bad. And finally, they stopped. Another announcement from down below said, okay, you guys are surrounded. Nothing we can do. Go back, try to get some sleep. And the next day they started negotiating. And what Colonel Hayashi wanted to do was trade his men, his 65 men, he and his 65 men, fully armed, and an escort out to their front lines, and then they would let us go, which actually happened. But before it could happen, the first Cav had to wait for reinforcements because we're still surrounded by the Japanese army who didn't know that we were in there, that the first Cav was in there. So this is 2 days later. So when they finally got the reinforcements, then they escorted them fully armed out to a few blocks away and let them go. And probably the Filipinos took care of them from there.